I took the coilovers off my Mercedes W210, and here's why. So I put PB Brakes brand coilovers on my W210 in April of 2017 with the help of some friends, and I ran them all the way until about December of 2017. Now during that time, this car was my daily driver. I drove it every single day, and I believe I have about 10 to 15,000 miles on that setup. So December 2017, I decided to start taking it off. So I decided to take the springs off first and retain the shocks. I switched to H&R springs, and then about in 2021, I got the Bilstien shocks to complete my setup. So the coilovers actually did ride really good, and I was actually pretty satisfied with them. My reasoning for taking them off is because in order to adjust any of the height, you have to remove the spring every single time, and I was just over it. So the adjustability, in my opinion, is both a pro and a con. There's just so much you can do with those coilovers that you can't with regular springs and shocks. One particular issue that I had on my car was even though that I measured the spring adjusters exactly with a caliper left and right, so like the driver's front and the passenger front would have just a little bit of difference between the two, and I want them to be perfectly even. So of course, chasing down that issue, you spend quite a bit of time tinkering with the suspension, and you really don't know what you're going to get until you put the car on the ground and you let it settle, you drive it a bit, and you see how it sits. So that is just one thing that is really annoying with the coilovers. So with this car, it is not a McPherson strut suspension, meaning the shock goes through the coil, hence the name Coilover. So this is not a true coilover setup in the name of the word. However, for a W210, if you want to run coilovers the proper way, I'd recommend the separate spring and shock setup with the spring adjuster that is mounted on top of the actual spring and a separate shock. At the time in 2017, there was only really 3 options for coilovers on the W210. So there was the KWs, which were very expensive at the time. There was the PB Brakes, which was kind of like the middle option, and then the K Sports, which was a little bit cheaper. So I decided to go with the PB Brakes because at the time I heard other W210 owners have it and they were very satisfied with the product. You know, in terms of ride quality, I was very satisfied. That product is 30 clicks adjustable on the dampening, and on the softest setting, it rode, in my opinion, almost as good as stock. Maybe not quite as soft as stock, but still very, very close, and still a very good ride. And I could, of course, turn it up all the way and become a very harsh ride. So that'd be really good if you're taking high-speed corners. Of course, just turning it up 30 clicks is not the right way to really dial in the handling. You gotta drive it and then, you know, test each setting, front and rear, and see how you like it. I generally always had it on the softest setting just because this car was like my daily driver. I didn't really go on the canyons too much. I never tracked the car, nor was that ever my intention. For a daily driver setup, I think that was a really good product. It looks like, from what I can gather online, the PB Brakes, the K Sports, and the BC Racing coilovers all have height adjustable spring perches. So that's the thing that sits on the top that adjusts the height of the car. And then the shocks are both dampening adjustable, and you can adjust the length of the shock to compensate for the height of the car. They're pretty basic in terms of coilovers. So some coilovers might offer a separate little adjuster for rebound. The coilovers that I had did not have that. The KW coilovers do not have shocks that are length adjustable. So pretty much on the KWs, the shocks are pretty short, so your car's going to ride low anyway, which I think most people that get coilovers want to ride low. Installation was obviously almost the same as doing springs and shocks, except for the fact that putting in a spring is a little bit more difficult because you generally cannot use a spring compressor. There just is enough room with the adjustable spring perch on top. Well, I keep calling it a spring perch, but it's really like an adjustable spring pad, because on the fronts, on the PB Brakes coilovers, you did not use the factory spring pads. On the rears, you did. So on my rears, I kept my factory number 2 pads on the rears when I installed mine. So shocks are super straightforward. However, on the springs, there is a limit to how high you can go on them in order to be able to get them in easily. Otherwise, you're going to have to unbolt your control arm in order to get the spring in, which is no fun. And all the times I did coilovers on this car and that That Great car that I did the installation video on, I had the springs low enough to be able to put in without unbolting the control arm. And that's another point. If you check out that coilover install video on the That Great car, that is the absolute highest you can go in the front without having to unbolt the control arm. What I ended up doing was it literally almost barely fit. I had someone actually hang down on the control arm with all their body weight to be able to sneak it in there, and it just barely made it. So that is the absolute highest you can go on those PB Brakes coilovers, which that's actually a fairly good height. It's pretty much what this car is at, maybe a little bit lower, but that is not too low in my opinion. It's very close to Euro height. The shocks were adjusted a little bit lower than they came. Still plenty of length in my opinion. That car never really 3-wheeled in my experience. My car, on the first setting I had it, I'll insert some pictures, it was pretty low. There's pretty much no wheel gap front and rear, so we'll see I have a little bit in the back and the front. Previously it was all 0 gap, so the car was pretty low. It would scrape the center exhaust, and luckily before paint I was able to drive it around on the coilovers, so I did scrape the front bumper quite a bit if I did not angle the car. And this car would actually 3-wheel over very steep driveways. That was kind of a strange feeling. I never experienced that in this car before, because this car would never 3-wheel stock, and it does not 3-wheel on the lowering spring and shock setup. And if you don't know what 3-wheeling is if you go up up on a steep incline, like a driveway specifically, and you kind of go at an angle, your car kind of teeter-totters because the suspension does not have enough droop to touch the ground. So it's usually this corner that would kind of lift off the ground and kind of spin. Of course, those are some of the issues that come with being too low. For some people, there's no such thing as too low. For me, I kind of had my limit there. That is when I decided, after I painted the car, I didn't want to deal with having to worry about going over everything sideways, and it was just a big headache for me after paint because I didn't want to scrape the front. So I decided to raise the car a little bit above where it is right now, and that was quite a big pain to do. It took quite a while because it is higher than I had it on the Tech gray car, so it was a struggle to get those springs in. That's what took the most amount of time. To get them out was really easy actually, but to get them in was almost impossible just because of how high they were. So I was actually happy with the height, but unfortunately it was still off side to side. So right now with the springs and the spring pads, this car actually sits pretty level side to side. But on the coilovers, I would say there is a pretty noticeable gap. So I know this is not an accurate way to measure it, but I would have like a 1 finger difference. So if I was to have, let's say, 2 fingers on the back left, I would have 1 finger on the back right. And I didn't like that. I didn't like how the car sat all lopsided. To get that really dialed in, of course, I'd have to take the springs out again, and it was just all eyeballing. There's no real science to it. And unfortunately, unlike a McPherson suspension, you can take the wheel off really easily, just adjust it on the car, set it back down, and see how it looks. On this car, you had to actually remove the spring every single time to do anything. So I was just really over that, and that is when I decided to go with H&R springs. For about almost 2 years, I was on the H&R springs and the PB Brake Coilover shocks, which is actually a pretty good setup. The car rode really soft, which I liked, and it was still fairly low. And of course, the height difference between left and right was much more even than it ever was on the coilovers, which was exactly what I wanted. And then a couple years later, I was finally able to get Bilstein B8 shocks to match with the H&R springs. So that is the setup I'm currently running. So unfortunately, by going to this setup, I lose any dampening adjustability on the Bilsteins. They have 0. If you get Coney yellows, they are adjustable, but they're only about, I think, 5 or 6 clicks of dampening adjustment, which is not very much. And they can ride pretty harsh on the harshest setting. 6 clicks versus 30, that's quite a big difference. The 30, you could still turn it up a bit and still have it nice and compliant, but still handle really well. With the PB Brake Coilover shocks, you were able to adjust them on the front by just opening the hood, going to where the shock is mounted, and there is a hole right there, and you could just use their adjuster. I never left the adjusters inside the shock because it was just kind of there loose, so I would leave it in my glove box or something, and every time I wanted to adjust, I just pop the hood and go ahead and turn up the coilovers in the front. And for the back, they were behind the carpet, so I'd have to remove the carpet every time to adjust them, which was kind of a pain, but really wasn't that bad to adjust the shocks. And to have 30-way adjustable dampening is pretty impressive, and it's actually really nice. That is something I do miss, and that is the only adjustment that I actually really like doing. I actually did not like doing the spring adjustment at all. It is the worst part about owning the coilovers, is adjusting the height. But otherwise, adjusting the dampening was really easy. To show you how to adjust the shocks, I would go under here, and on mine, I still have my covers, and these covers fit over the coilovers as well. Right here, we'll see this one, there's no hole, but on the coilovers, there's a hole right there, right in the center, where you would stick the adjuster, and then you could twist it clockwise to stiffen up the suspension, counterclockwise to soften it up. Generally, I had it all the way soft at all times just because I commuted with the car. I didn't need to have a harsh ride on the freeway, so that is how I ran my car for the majority of the time I had the coilovers. And to speak on the dampening, I actually had a friend ride with me in this car on the softest setting, and he's like, wow, this is really soft, it's just like stock. And he didn't think the coilovers were all that impressive. Then I pulled over, I turned it up all the way to 30 clicks front and rear, and then he was quite impressed with how much the car changed its driving dynamic. So just the range that the coilovers gave you was really nice. However, I just had enough of it with adjusting the height because I was never satisfied with where it's at. But I think if you don't mind playing with the height so much, taking the spring out every time to adjust it, I think it's a great product. I would recommend it to anybody. And in fact, some ways, I think it's better than the KWs with the adjustability. However, I do know the KWs ride extremely good as well. They do handle extremely well too. Of course, it's made in Germany. It's a great product as well, but the PB brakes are much cheaper, much easier to buy. And that is what I would recommend if you want to get into coilovers. Of course, if you can justify the price of the KWs, that is an excellent product to go for. For me, I just wanted something close to Euro height, which I think I got. You can, of course, try to buy the Euro AMG springs, which they are quite a bit more expensive than H&Rs. With H&Rs, I'm on number 3 pads up front, number 1 in the back. And the reason is usually these cars, if you have even wheel gap front and back, it is kind of sitting raked. If you look at it with the frame, this is unfortunately not an even surface. But if you have a little bit more gap in the front, like I do, and a little bit less in the back, it is actually level to the ground from the frame. Otherwise, if you have even front and back, it sits kind of face down, the rear in the air, and I really hate that stance. I think that would bother me more than anything else. So that's why like all my cars are set up like this. They're level from the frame, even though the wheel gaps front and back are uneven. So the H&Rs allowed me to achieve the height I wanted. I decided to switch out the shocks just because with the way that the springs are set up, when the shocks are fully extended, they would make contact with the spring perch just ever so slightly. My spring perches are cosmetically scratched, unfortunately, but luckily structurally they're okay. I went ahead and got the Bilstein B8s instead of the conies, and I do have conies on my 124, and I do have experience driving a W210 with conies all around, and they are excellent products, of course. It was just a little bit too harsh for me, and I've never tried Bilstein B8s before, so I wanted to go ahead and do it. The conies were not that much more expensive than Bilsteins. You could totally do either or. I went with the Bilstein B8s. The B8s are designed for lowering springs like the H&Rs. According to Bilstein, the shock body is about 1 inch shorter than the Bilstein B6, which is their heavy duty shock. So the valving between the B6 and the B8 is identical. It's just the shock length is different to compensate for lowering springs. So if you just want to firm up the ride of your stock car, you could just get the B6. Really simple install, does not affect your suspension geometry at all. These shocks are completely independent of all that. It's about 2 bolts per corner, so super easy to do. Just need to have the right tools and it goes by really quickly. So I installed that, and I believe there is a break-in period to these shocks because the first couple hundred miles of driving it, the car felt pretty harsh. I think I actually only have maybe 1,000 to 2,000 miles on these shocks, so they are definitely broken in by now, but they don't have like crazy high usage on them. Now the car rides a little bit better and actually handles extremely well. One thing I noticed going to the shocks from the PB Brake Coilover shocks and the H&R springs was that the car was much more stable at high speed. So at high speed, the car kind of felt like it was floating everywhere with the H&Rs and PB Brake Coilovers. That could have been because I had them adjusted to completely soft. That could have been because the shocks are not matched with the springs. But right now, this car has driven better than it ever has. The ride is a little bit more firm. I wouldn't say it's harsh, it's a little bit more firm than it is stock. However, it does handle way better than it ever has. The body roll is so minimal. It still rides really good. So if you can keep your car pretty clean, we can actually see my Bilstein B8s right there behind my brakes. That's kind of cool to have a little bit of color there. It does kind of clash with my red calipers and my black paint, but people will know you got some Bilsteins, or even the conies are that color too. The H&R springs that I got were matte blue. I probably try to insert a picture somewhere. So let's talk alignment. So when I was on the PB Brake Coilovers, I was pretty low. So I had about -3 degrees of camber in the back and about -2 in the front. So of course this is way out of spec. However, if you have a good alignment, the camber won't affect your tires all that much. It will have a little bit of effect, but it's not like it's going to eat them up like immediately. I put about 10 to 15,000 miles on this car with the PB Brake Coilover setup, and my rear tires lasted all the way. In fact, they wore evenly. I still have them. I'll try to get a picture of them, but they wore completely even all around, even with that -3 degrees of camber, and the fronts were pretty even as well. So my tire pressure settings I think were like 39 all around. They're pretty high. I like having them higher just the way that I drive the car. So the alignment on the H&Rs at this current setup, front was about -1.2 and the rear I think it was about -1.8. With this setup, the camber is within the specification for a W210 E55 alignment, so my tires will wear evenly. Everything on the alignment chart was in the green, so in my opinion this is a great setup to keep your alignment within spec and still be a little bit lower. It's not super low as you can see, but it is, I think it looks much better than stock, of course. I just wanted something Euro height, something that drove really good, something I didn't have to worry about, so that is why I decided to go to H&R springs and Bilstein B8 shocks. Of course, getting some quality tires will make a big difference in rides, so I am running Michelin Pilot Sport 4S in the factory US size 245/40 in the front and 275/35 in the rear, 18-inch wheels. These are the W210 E55 staggered wheels on my car. So I'm extremely happy with this setup. I would recommend to anybody. I think if you are willing to put in the work to have the coilovers, I think they're worth having on your car. One more thing I want to touch on is I think with the spring and shock setup of the factory style suspension, that spring pad does a little bit of compensating for weight. So that's probably why with the springs the way that they are with the spring pads, the car sits more evenly left and right. With the coilovers, it's just all metal. There's very little compression to them, which you'd think would actually have a really harsh ride, but it's a really, really good ride. So that is my theory on why the coilovers kind of sat a little weird left to right. I don't quite remember what the spring rates were, but clearly they weren't anything crazy. So on that Tech Gray E55 I installed them on, that was for a friend. Those are my old coilovers. He actually really liked them. He knows that it improved the car's handling capabilities, and it wasn't a harsh ride at all. He never once complained about the ride. So I think he was really satisfied when he had that on the car. He unfortunately sold that car, so he no longer owns it, so we probably won't see it on the channel anymore. The new owner did report he did like the way the car drove. So just in case anyone was wondering, the hybrid setup I had with the H&R springs and the coilover shocks, I really wouldn't recommend it. They're not meant to be together, and the car actually kind of drove pretty bad in terms of handling. It was very soft, of course. It drove really nice on the highway and on the streets. High-speed turning was not that much fun. It's way more capable now than it ever has been with the H&Rs and Bilsteins. But if you just want to have this setup like this, you know, you put the springs in, you play with the spring pads just a little bit, and then you set it and forget it. I think that's the best way to go. This car is not a track car. I would never track this car. I mean, if you want, you probably could on the coilovers. You gotta decide what your driving styles are and make a decision. But hopefully you found the information I gave you helpful, and that will kind of point you in the right direction. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them below, and thank you for watching.